By 1802, Beethoven had moved to the Viennese suburb of Heiligenstadt in an attempt to preserve his fleeting hearing. It was during this time that he wrote his famous Heiligenstadt Testament, in which he described his loss of hearing and the great psychological pain this caused him. But as is often the case, the music he wrote during this period shows little sign of Beethoven's inner turmoil. The Second Symphony begins as a model of classical proportion and reserve, although we're always aware of Beethoven's ferocious energy and modernism. After a call to attention, the first movement begins smoothly in the woodwinds. But as it progresses, the tension ratchets up, building to an allegro bubbling over with enthusiasm. The first movement has a remarkable coda, the last few minutes, in which heavy accents in the cellos and bassas give us the impression of someone stalking us. All seems to be well for a moment, but Beethoven has tricked us. The stalking begins again, leading to an extraordinarily dissonant climax or catharsis, after which the sunshine returns. It's the kind of musical mind game that Beethoven excelled at. The second movement is a larghetto, and it's incredibly beautiful. This is music of great calmness, although it continually strays down angst-ridden alleyways. But each time, the music returns to its original graceful character. And there's something quite profound about Beethoven's insistence on balance and beauty after each disturbing episode. It's as if he's trying to control what was happening in his personal life in the music. The scherzo is restless, it feels over-caffeinated and full of oddly placed accents. And the trio is very grand and in D major, hinting at the trio of the Ninth Symphony, which would follow years later. There are also moments with obsessive hammering F-sharps, as if the strings are stuck on one idea and can't let go. Wildness returns in the finale. It begins with one of Beethoven's most memorable themes, a high screech followed by a low rumble. This theme is a reminder of why some of Beethoven's contemporaries considered him a comedian rather than a composer. Mozart's Clarinet Concerto is his last completed orchestral composition. At the tender age of 35, Mozart had fallen out of fashion with the fickle Viennese public. The Austrian Empire was poor after a long war with Turkey, and there wasn't much demand for new music. Mozart's late work is characterized by a simple profundity. If we think of Sarastro's arias in his opera The Magic Flute, or the motet for choir Ave Verum Corpus, or the B-flat major piano concerto, there's a wonderful stillness and ease in Mozart's style. It was as if he had nothing left to prove, very different from the deliberate compositional virtuosity of, say, the finale of Don Giovanni. The Clarinet Concerto was written for Anton Stadler, a friend of Mozart's in the Masons. The clarinet was still a relatively new instrument. Mozart loved its chocolatey sound, and the pieces he wrote established the clarinet as a regular member of the woodwind family. The first movement is incredibly translucent and simple, with an unusual focus on the first melody the clarinet plays. The adagio is incredibly peaceful. It's a simple song in 3 parts. And the rondo, the last movement, is playful, but not especially mischievous. Perhaps the escapism of this music, the peacefulness that it demonstrates, which was at odds with Mozart's chaotic life, has endeared it to many of us since. For these performances, we welcome Anthony McGill, the principal clarinetist of the New York Philharmonic and one of the greatest clarinetists alive today. We're delighted to welcome him to Jacksonville for his debut performance. Sibelius completed his 7th symphony in 1924, but it had a long genesis from at least 1917, at the same time as he was composing the 6th symphony and revising the 5th. He originally called it a Fantasia Sinfonica because of its unusual form. The piece is composed in one single movement, unlike most symphonies we know, which are in 4. A comment from Sibelius's diary in 1912 explains a lot about the 7th, even though he was talking about another piece. He wrote, "I intend to let the musical ideas and their development in my mind determine the form." Now, what is development in music? It's when a fragment of melody is changed over time by extending or shortening it, or using different harmony to accompany it. In classical symphonies, development is mainly confined to the middle portion of a movement. Then it stops, and we hear the same material again. But Sibelius steps away from this tradition, allowing the material to develop right from the beginning of the symphony and allowing it to continue the whole way through without limits, like cells growing under a microscope. And unlike a classical symphony, which has a shape into which the musical ideas are placed, the shape of Sibelius' symphony follows the development of the ideas, as if the musical material is alive and building its own house. The 7th begins in darkness. We hear very slow music with an ominous rising scale. It's as if it's built of granite. Then the mood changes to something pastoral, and we hear a deeply nostalgic passage ushered in by woodwinds. For me, the 7th Symphony is about summation. The opening minute seems to be looking back on a life, like the moment before death, in which your entire life is rumored to flash before your eyes. But in this flash, we feel a profound sense of completion. All this happens in a remarkably brief and compressed time frame. Sibelius was a master of moving between different speeds of music without us noticing, a technique we call metric modulation. Suddenly, we've left the noble mountaintop from which all is clear, and we're back in the thick of everyday life's bustle. It's as if we've traveled back into the life we'd just seen flash before us. This energetic music is the equivalent of a scherzo in most symphonies. But almost immediately, the cheerful music is pulled down into a malignant swamp of doubt. Suddenly, everything is a struggle again. The human will to survive re-emerges, and the music regains momentum and optimism. As the symphony progresses, we leave the sense of the everyday behind and return to the mountaintop from where we saw the broader picture at the beginning. Whatever perspective we've gained has been hard-won, and the final minutes of the symphony present music of great wisdom and solace, but perhaps tinged with regret. Sibelius achieves these effects through extraordinary control of harmony. He often piles up chords on top of each other in great clusters, and through melody, which is ever fluid, giving it uncanny psychological depth. As the 7th ends, only 22 minutes after it began, we've traveled through an entire lifetime, an experience both harrowing and deeply enriching.